Hello, I am Timothy Unruh, Executive Director of the National Association of Energy Service Companies, otherwise known as NAESCO. I am glad you could join us today for our webinar, Sustainable Energy as a Service. This must be a topic of great interest, as we had nearly 200 registrants for the event, our largest online happening ever. At NAESCO, we recognize that our members are deeply engaged and represent the pinnacle of expertise in energy savings performance contracting. However, we also know that our members want to be informed about market changes and developments. Presenting today are two member companies that are actively providing this new form of energy contract. Again, thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to take a moment for our sponsors. Global Energy Services is a national diversified company with more than 25 years of experience and expertise in lighting retrofits, water conservation, and building envelope. As a woman-owned business, we are committed to transforming facilities across the U.S. into the most energy-efficient enterprises possible. From professional-grade energy audits to intelligent energy solutions, we strive to bring municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals seamless value across all platforms. Furthermore, Global Energy Services has completed 6 large military projects as part of their efforts in the federal market. Well, welcome to our seminar today. It's great to have you all here. And the video said that we had nearly 200. As of today, we had almost 270 people registered for the event. So it's great to have everyone here today. I'll take a moment and introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Bob Hinkle, who's the CEO and president of Metrus Energy. Bob and Metrus recently joined NAESCO as members, and Bob established Metrus in 2009, working in the energy field most of his career. Our other speaker today is Geoff Culm with Bank of America. He's the managing director and manager of energy services and government finance. And between the two of these speakers today, we should have a great set of conversations about the industry of energy savings, sustainable energy as a service, and the financing behind such structures. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff and Bob, who will take us away with the agenda.
Yeah, terrific, Tim. Hello, everyone. This is Geoff Culm from Bank of America. So drawing your attention to slide 4 in the agenda and go over what we're going to cover in this webinar. So first off, we will describe what is a sustainable energy as a service agreement. You'll hear it referred to as SEAAS, but also a little bit shorter acronym, just the SESA. And then we'll talk about the comparison of an SESA to performance contracting. We'll go over the project life cycle and the cash flow and the economic analysis. And then we'll give a few SESA case studies. And then, of course, most importantly, at the end, questions and answers from the viewership. So I look forward to it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Hinkle to get us started.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and before we dive into the presentation, I just wanted to say I'm excited to be speaking here with all of you. As Tim was mentioning, the turnout is fantastic, and I think it speaks a lot to what's going on in the market and the industry with sustainable energy as a service. So happy to be here and want to thank Tim, Heidi, and really all in NAESCO for organizing and hosting this event. So moving to the next slide, I can start out by first answering the question, okay, so why cows? First is a little bit of an attempt at as a service humor, but second, there's a true story behind it, and that involves Dartmouth College, where the president of Dartmouth put up a picture of a cow to his board during a presentation when he was pitching the idea of having a third party come in and finance and own their energy infrastructure. He said there was a time when we needed to own cows to get milk. We don't own cows anymore, and we also don't need to own power plants in order to get energy efficiency and clean energy on campus. And to me, this really exemplifies what more and more customers are saying, and saying it with increasing frequency, and that is that you can receive the benefits of, energy savings, clean energy upgrades, upgraded facilities. You can do all that without paying any upfront costs and without dealing with the hassles of ownership of that equipment and a lot of the ongoing monitoring and maintenance of that. So with that, why don't we move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the whole movement towards as a service. Although sustainable energy as a service, I think, is something that's often thought of as something that's slightly new in our world, it really has its origins in some very well-proven financing structures, and a lot of those are in our energy space. And this definitely includes traditional performance contracting, which dates back to the 1970s, where ESCOs coupled the delivery of turnkey project design, engineering, and construction alongside long-term energy savings performance guarantees. And, this is obviously a market that folks on the call here and everyone within NAESCO is very familiar with, and, honestly really helped build and create. But, as you know, a lot of that work, traditional performance contracting, has been done in the federal sector or in the municipal world and K-12 type, school district type projects. Moving to the next element on the slide, sustainable energy as a service, I think, also really builds on and probably more closely resembles the more recent success of the renewable energy industry, particularly in utilizing power purchase agreements or PPAs with third-party financiers and owners of projects that has shown the benefits of buying solar power instead of, buying the solar panels, and really having, an output-based type arrangement where you're buying renewable energy electricity and not owning those assets. So a lot of similarities between the as-a-service model and power purchase agreements. The next element on the slide, I think, just reminds us what I think a lot of us know already, and that's as a service is not entirely unique to energy efficiency or clean energy. It's something that's been transformational for many key parts of our economy. So certainly the IT industry, the shared economy, where third-party ownership and the efficient use often of existing resources or assets has fueled growth and change. And that can be in cloud-based computing, dealing with transportation, cars, or homes. All that has really helped fuel that growth and change. And if you go to the last element on the slide, I think it's fair to think of sustainable energy as a service as really at the intersection of all these key areas, where there's both the use of as a service is expanding both the scale and the speed of what can be accomplished. And it's being accomplished by providing no first cost solutions to customers. So there's 100% funding of the upfront costs of projects through a third-party owned structure that's also off balance sheet to customers, where customers are paying for things on a pay for performance basis or a pay for output type basis. So customers are paying for a realized amount of measured savings on a cost per unit of energy saved or a cost per unit of renewable energy generated. So that can be paying on a megawatt style cost per kWh of electricity saved, or a cost per therm of natural gas saved, or a per kWh unit of solar power or renewable energy that's generated. All that gets embedded within an as a service type agreement. Also, as it's designed, it should be an open source solution, something that's agnostic in terms of the type of equipment or software that's utilized. And even the ESCO or the contractor that's involved, it should be a very customer-centric, flexible type solution that is utilized to design the right technical scope for customers to fit the needs of their specific facility. And all these different attributes, I think, are coupling together to help drive what we're seeing in terms of larger projects with deeper amounts of energy savings, speeding up the rate at which projects are implemented, and also achieving deeper levels of carbon reduction. If we go to the next slide, you can really see, I think, the depth of different upgrades or measures that can be included in a project. So by definition, you should be casting a pretty wide net in terms of what you're looking at a facility. So this can include certainly going after lower cost, quick payback period items like lighting and controls, but also tackling some of the longer payback period measures that often go undone or delayed. So more capital-intensive mechanical upgrades like the replacement of boilers or chillers. And there's also an increasing trend of bundling clean energy, be it solar PV, energy storage, EV charging infrastructure, alongside traditional energy efficiency. So bundling together energy efficiency with clean energy. And I think that really underscores a lot of the trends in the market, and really the reason I think to call this whole movement or part of the industry as sustainable energy as a service. I think we've seen different variations out there where I've seen obviously lighting as a service, infrastructure as a service, cooling as a service, even steam traps as a service. And, all of that work I think is great. And it all really gets encapsulated and defined by sustainable energy as a service, really as an overarching element or lens for it. And I think that best reflects what these projects are about, because they're about harvesting efficiencies that are on site at customers' facilities right now. They're about generating savings in terms of reductions on someone's utility bill. And they're also increasingly about generating reductions in terms of on-site carbon emissions and moving folks towards increasingly ambitious ESG targets and objectives. Moving to the next slide takes it a step further and maybe more defines it within what a typical contract term or project will look like. So certainly single measure projects are possible. You can definitely have lighting only projects that are out there, but often you're seeing projects include a half dozen or more different types of upgrades that improve the electric and thermal efficiency of a customer site. And bundling these measures together is key, because if you bundle different efficiency upgrades together into single projects, you can help achieve different outcomes in terms of deeper levels of energy savings. You're capturing a much broader range in terms of facility improvements, and just frankly getting more done at a customer site. In terms of what that translates into in terms of project size, again, the project size is certainly dependent on the type of facility, the size of it, and the different upgrades that are involved in a project. But generally, projects are north of $1 million, and probably on average are falling between $3 to $5 million per project. One exception to the $1 million or more guideline there is if you have a single customer that owns multiple sites. So, for sake of example, a customer that owns 4 sites and you see $500,000 of opportunity at each of those 4 sites, they can be bundled together into a $2 million type project. So that can be done, but often, this is about getting scale and bundling together to larger transaction sizes. When you look at those different projects and think about them in terms of their underlying economics, the weighted average payback period on projects often falls in the 5 to 10 year range. And again, this is achieved by bundling together short and long-term payback period measures to fit as many possible upgrades for energy efficiency or for renewable energy measures as possible into a single project. And that underlying economics really will correlate and help dictate the contract term that's entered into. So you can definitely have sub 10-year service agreements with customers. Often that's for lighting or maybe lighting and BMS projects where it's a quicker payback. But anytime you start to bring in some of the mechanical upgrades, you get those longer payback periods, and then you start to see terms for agreements that are in the 10 to 15 year range, which is very typical for us at Metrus. But you can also have projects with terms that go out 20 years, and that really depends on the type of customer and the market that you're in. Going to the next slide and maybe taking just a step back and looking at the broader market, no matter what source you look at, the market for as a service is large and growing. Off to the right here on the slide, you can see some numbers from Guidehouse, formerly Navigant, that put together a report looking at the broader, what they call energy as a service market. And you can see that by 2028, that market is approaching $300 billion. So it's a huge market with lots of potential. And what's driving that potential are some trends, some of which I've touched on briefly. And one is that customers are definitely seeking integrated solutions. So taking together not only individual energy efficiency measures and bundling them together, but taking into account objectives and goals that relate to renewable energy or clean energy. So that's driving the market. There's also a growing movement that is accelerating and will continue to do so towards the low carbon economy. You do have a lot of customers out there that have big ESG targets and mandates, and those are often unfunded mandates. And the dates on some of those targets are getting closer. So the as-a-service solution is something that is really a key way to get those projects moving and get them moving now and get things done where customers aren't incurring. I think one of the things that probably is talked about least is the cost of delay that customers see on a lot of projects where they take more of a staggered approach to getting things done. There's an economic cost to that, both the customers, and then there's an environmental cost in terms of the emissions that could be avoided if we could move forward more quickly. And that's what sustainable energy as a service is all about, is giving that reason and vehicle for the momentum to really make a step change in what we're doing on all kinds of fronts, our businesses, but also in terms of how we're tackling climate change. Also, all these trends are going on at a time that I think everyone knows and is seeing increasing budgetary pressure, and that's in the public sector, but it's in the private sector too. And that increasing budgetary pressure is coinciding with the need to upgrade aging buildings and facilities. So a lot is coming together. There's a lot of work to do. I know it's things that everyone on this call is focused on, but that's how we're seeing sustainable energy as a service as a way to really help move the needle. Going to the next slide, a little bit of a transition here. In talking with Geoff, we were thinking it would be beneficial to just compare a little bit of the nuts and bolts of sustainable energy as a service at the transaction level to traditional performance contracting. So with that, Geoff, why don't you take over for the next couple slides here, and we'll dig into the details.
Terrific. Thanks, Bob. So if I can draw everyone's attention to slide number 12, this is a diagram of a traditional energy performance contracting transaction along with the financing. And as you can see there from the diagram, the EPC is separate from the financing. So you have there on the left the ESCO or the vendor and the EPC with the customer in the middle, and then the customer has a separate contract, either a tax-exempt capital lease purchase agreement or taxable capital lease financing or loan, secured loan with the lender. And what's critical to remember is in the event of a shortfall under the traditional performance contracting model, and this is other than the right of full non-appropriation in a muni transaction, the customer does not have the right to set off their payment to the lender relating to performance or underperformance of the equipment. So in the event of a shortfall, the customer would go through the guaranteed energy savings contract with the ESCO to obtain that shortfall payment. But the customer, regardless of that payment being made, that customer still has to make their full financing payment to the lender if they want to retain use of the equipment. And if I can flip you to the next slide and how this compares to a SESA contract, at its core, a sustainable energy as a service is a traditional project finance structure that is governed by well-defined contracts. For each project, the service provider enters into directly the energy services agreement or the sustainable energy services agreement, the SESA, with the customer. The SESA details the project scope, so the make, model, type of equipment, and the location of the equipment, and then also the cost per unit of energy saved or generated during the SESA term. The service charges, I should say, paid by the customer is typically a cost per kilowatt hour of electricity saved or generated that is set below the customer's current utility rate, and that's key. The SESA is a master, as Bob described, the SESA is a master services type contract that is replicatable across the customer's entire portfolio of sites and can be used to fund a wide range of energy efficiency and clean energy measures. The SESA has standard master terms and conditions, as well as a set of project-specific exhibits that detail the upgrades to be installed, and then, as importantly, how the savings will be measured over the contract term. So here, in parallel to entering into the SESA with the customer, the service provider also enters into the ESPC agreement with the ESCO. and that covers the installation, the maintenance, and the monitoring of the project performance. That ESPC between the ESCO and the service provider also includes a performance guarantee on the energy savings during each year of the SCSA contract. It's different than a traditional PC deal where the guarantee to the customer doesn't always run for the full contract term. And of course, state statutes, customer preferences notwithstanding. And then of course, also the service provider would enter into or embed the financing with a lender into this overall contract. And so if you look at, just to summarize on page 14, the key differences between a performance contract and an SCSA. So again, the SCSA is a single contract between the customer and the service provider that integrates the financial and technical services required to implement a project. And again, that's different than the slide which I showed you, where the customer would enter into two separate contracts, the EPC and then also a financing. Under an SCSA, the third-party ownership of efficiency and clean energy assets, and it's also a service agreement where the customers do not assume a fixed debt obligation, and that's key to the contract. The payments are variable based on the ongoing measured savings, and the SCSA providers take on additional performance risk over and above a traditional ESCO guarantee by underwriting projects to 100% of the expected savings. And so, further discussing the economics of this, I'll hand this back to Bob to talk about the development cycle for an SCSA project.
Great. So advancing over through the divider to slide 16. If you look at the project life cycle, the service provider is really involved throughout all key phases of a project's life cycle. So the development, the financing, and the operations of a project. In the development phase, again, you're taking a pretty wide, broad brush approach in terms of the different possible efficiency measures or renewable energy upgrades that can be tackled at a site. And you're doing that through the traditional preliminary assessment, detailed assessment. So some on-site technical analyses that go on through a very comparable development cycle to what you'd see on a traditional performance contracting deal. And the service provider will work with the ESCO partner and the customer to identify what are the right attractive upgrades to include in a project. And the service provider will really hone in on more of the financial engineering of a project, looking at the different paybacks and savings opportunities for various efficiency measures, coming up with some alternative project scopes to show a customer and the ESCO partner to try to match up with what the customer's objectives are from a technical and financial and operational point of view. Once that proper scope is documented and is ready to go, you'll then see the service provider finance 100% of that upfront cost of the project. And that'll be done in part with equity from the service provider and also outside debt. So you're seeing a blend of equity and debt in terms of getting to that 100% financing solution for customers. And then the project construction phase will kick off. And construction periods, vary as you'd expect based on the type of project that's involved, but typically 6 to 12 months is what we see in terms of construction period lengths. And during that term, the ESCO will do their work in terms of design and construction of projects and be paid on a progress payment type basis. So again, very similar traditional work. And then once a project gets to its substantial completion, ends the construction period, the service provider will be the owner of those assets. And also during this operational period, I think it's worth just pointing out that the ESCO and the service provider will work together to try to monetize any and all available state or utility incentives and really roll those into the project. A lot of that work will be done up front during the detailed energy assessment phase, but you do look to bring in all available incentives, and that can help lead to a bigger project scope that maybe gets more efficiency upgrades done that otherwise wouldn't be done without it, or it can be used to just improve the overall cost per unit of energy saved that the customer is paying. Now, once a project completes the construction phase and becomes operational, then the measurement of ongoing savings will start. And the realized and measured savings will be conducted during each and every year of the Sustainable Energy Services Agreement. And that will be done utilizing some, pretty traditional IPMVP type protocols where there will be some fixed baseline elements, but then during each and every year, there will be ongoing measurements of equipment efficiency performance. So it's, something that won't stop after a couple of years. It forms the basis for the actual payments that customers make during whatever the term of the agreement is, whether it's 5, 10, or 15 years. Customers then pay a services charge that's really a price times quantity type charge, where the price will be set on a cost per unit of energy saved. So again, a cost per kWh of electricity saved, or a cost per kWh of renewable energy that's generated. And whatever the measured output or savings is during a given period, then will be utilized as the quantity to be multiplied by the price to get that services charge that the customer will be paying. And customer payments are typically done on a quarterly basis. There's some projects where it's done monthly, but generally it's a quarterly type basis of payment. And that means that if there's a 9-month construction period, the customer's first payment should be 1 year after construction starts, so that you have that 3-month period. Also, during the operational phase, the service provider will be paying the ESCO for ongoing maintenance and monitoring of a project, so ongoing M&V, ongoing maintenance regimes that are applicable or needed by customers depending on the scope of work under a project. So there'll be ongoing recurring revenue for ESCOs as part of this work that goes beyond the construction. But then also these arrangements, as I mentioned, go on for 10 or 15 years or more. And as part of this, the service provider and the ESCO really will be looking for new energy efficiency measures at a customer site to potentially add into the original project. That can be done. You can add in new measures later on and have the customer pay the same cost per kWh saved that was agreed upon earlier, and just add new measures in. So making a sustainable energy services agreement more of an ongoing procurement program for sustainability initiatives rather than a single point in time financing like a lease. But it also could be just utilized to develop and build the next scope of project. And then just the last part of the slide here is as projects move through their life cycle, customers are going to continue to reap the benefits of these projects. And that is going to be energy savings, lower energy bills, healthier buildings, more efficient buildings, and more resilient buildings. So all that's part of kind of the ongoing continuous cycle of projects. So moving on to the next slide, I'll have Geoff talk a little bit about just the cash flow mechanics on deals, looking at it over an example 10-year deal.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thanks, Bob. So drawing everyone's attention to slide number 17 with the project cash flow. This slide matches the project life cycle with a typical project cash flow. And then in the initial phase of the project, which is to the left, you see that the service provider is funding 100% of the upfront project costs, which is used to pay the ESCO or the contractor for the construction. This funding is part bank debt and also part equity from the service provider. During this time, as Bob said, the customer makes no payments while the construction is ongoing. Once the project is operational, the customer begins to pay for the measured savings, keeping a portion of the savings during the service agreement term, but typically paying the majority of the savings to the service provider, who of course funded the project and is paying for the ongoing services through the ESPC with the ESCO. At the end of the service agreement term, the customer can elect to purchase the project at its fair market value, and at that point, the customer receives 100% of the ongoing savings. I'm going to hand this back to Bob for slide 18 to talk about meeting the needs of the diverse stakeholders associated with these contracts.
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, the benefits of these type of arrangements, I think they can be segmented into financial and operational buckets. So starting first with the financial benefits. We've talked a lot about this, but there's no capital outlay. This is a 100% financing solution. So customers can get more work done now than they likely could if they were trying to push all these projects through their capital budgeting process, where maybe they would have some tough payback period hurdle rates to hit that might throttle a little bit of what they can get done. So to that point of speed and getting more done, this is something that should be a catalyst. It's also, as we talked about, a pay for performance type arrangement. So it's something that's off balance sheet. There's true third-party ownership of assets. You have an outside equity owner of these assets. You have a pay-for-performance arrangement where payments will go up and down based on realized energy savings or the output of renewable energy projects. And then you have the service provider taking on different elements of operational control and risk, which are key to the accounting treatment, and really having things viewed as a services agreement and not a lease. Also, on the financial benefits, projects should be cash flow positive for customers. If you're looking at a project for a customer, say for sake of example, where their utility rate is 8 cents per kilowatt hour they're consuming all in, you know, generation, transmission, distribution, all that rolled into a rate, and they're paying 8 cents per kilowatt hour they're consuming, a service provider might go in and look to charge, say, 7 cents per kilowatt hour saved, and, you know, saved and measured. So customers should be cash flow positive on all projects. There's also a certain amount of de-risking, since there is ongoing measured savings that'll be done in each and every year of the contract using agreed upon measurement and verification protocols. So it's not a fixed payment like a lease. It will go up and down based on performance. And again, there is the effort to maximize any and all available incentives that are out there in the marketplace and bring those into projects to benefit customers, both in terms of their economics, but to get more scope done. In terms of the next element on the slide, really looking at the operational benefits, these are, of course, turnkey projects. So there's the integrated delivery of everything you need on the technical and engineering side, coupled with the financing side. So it really should be something that eases the implementation of projects for customers. These projects are also funding a wide range of efficiency upgrades. So a wide range of equipment that definitely will include critical energy assets that should improve not only the efficiency, but also the operational reliability and resiliency of customers' facilities. And also, again, from an operational perspective, sustainable energy as a service agreements will be covering selected ongoing operation and maintenance that is needed and appropriate for the type of equipment that's involved. And there'll also be that ongoing monitoring of project performance. And both of these things will just help ensure, you know, provide some added elements of security or coverage in terms of the performance of the project. The monitoring during each and every year will help ensure some ongoing transparency of savings that'll go on throughout the project term. Moving to the next sequence of slides, and we can advance up to slide 20. There's a few case studies we thought would be good to just talk about before we get into some of your questions. So the first one here is an ongoing long-term program that we have with BAE Systems. So BAE Systems is a large aerospace and defense contracting firm. And this series of projects that we have with BAE Systems, there's 6 separate projects, 3 different states. So it really spans multiple sites, multiple states. The projects are pretty typical in terms of having a blend of different efficiency improvement measures. So some lighting and controls, but also some mechanical upgrades that were tougher to get done because of the long payback period and, you know, restrictions in terms of capital budgeting processes. So a lot of that work was able to get done because of the blending of this, because there was third-party capital coming in through a services arrangement. A lot of that work was able to get done. And I think it's just worth noting these projects are now, some of them are entering their 10th year of operation. So there's a good track record out there of work that's done, and these projects have all performed well in terms of their realized savings compared to some of the original expected savings. So there's a good base and body of work out there. Going to the next example or case study, this is for a Fortune 100 customer, and it's a large program. It's focused really on 2 core measures, lighting and building management systems, but it's bundling those different technologies together into these projects. But what I think is interesting from a bundling perspective for this program is that it isn't just about bringing together LED lighting with BMS systems and getting more work done. It's bundling together different sites. And in this case, different sites that are often thousands of miles apart. And what that means is that you're doing an LED lighting project in a state that might have high energy rates, and then you're doing that same project at a different facility in a different state with lower energy rates. but you're doing it for the same customer. Now, without the as-a-service type approach here, the projects in those lower energy cost states might not get done. Under this type of approach, you're able to bundle together, much like you'd bundle together a lighting upgrade with a new chiller at an individual site. You can take this different site approach and get the scale. And, here you see obviously a very large program with a large number of sites. And, I think it's something that's going to be done on an increasing basis that way. The next slide just goes to a different market sector and I guess touches obviously on hospitals and healthcare, but I think also speaks to the applicability of projects in higher education and the public sector as well. And this is a project with Bristol Hospital in Connecticut. So a lot of longer term payback period measures here, some lighting, but a lot of this was about getting done a lot of deferred maintenance on work that was just perpetually being pushed off and was able to be accelerated and done through an as-a-service type arrangement. And again, it's something that I think applies across the board to other market segments. So with that, why don't we advance to the Q&A slide and hear what folks have to say. But thanks for listening to us here and look forward to the questions. And I'll let Tim take it away.
All right, sorry about that delay. I had to switch all the systems around. It's a great story you told, and thanks for that, Bob and Geoff. That's a really good presentation. I have a few questions that have come in, and I'll start with one. This would be probably for Geoff, is how does a lender look at or think about sustainable energy as a service versus traditional performance contracting from an ESCO underwriting perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Great question. And the answer is the lenders look at these very differently. So just as I spelled out in the diagram, where in a typical EPC, the lender is ultimately underwriting to the credit of the customer. And to the extent that the equipment performs or doesn't perform, that doesn't impact the payment to the lender, again, outside of on the muni side, the full right of non-appropriation. Here, under an ESA and SCSA, as a service contract, the lender is taking additional risks in underwriting these transactions. So specifically the additional performance risk that comes up with the customer's ability to offset or only pay for savings that are actually achieved. And so from a lender's perspective, the lenders will dig into these contracts much more thoroughly than they would a typical EPC to assess the underlying project, how the savings are calculated, of course, the credit of the underlying customer, but then also the credit quality of the ESCO and of the contractor, because ultimately the credit is bifurcated between the customer's credit and the ESCO's credit, because the lender will be taking the risk, shortfall risk associated with that ESCO's payment guarantee for the term of the contract. Now, certainly, as we've described in this presentation, having a service provider provide an equity component into that does obviously come into play in the underwriting. But again, in answer to the question, underwriters and lenders will look at these projects very differently than a typical EPC.
So we have a lot of questions that have been submitted. Just a reminder, if you want to submit questions, please do so through the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your browser or whatever system you're happen to be looking at. There should be a Q&A option there. And let's go to one from Richard Santangelo, who says, who keeps utility company savings? Are the savings included in my kilowatt hour savings for payments?
So maybe a little bit, I guess I'm trying to get a clarification there a little bit. So who keeps utility savings? I guess maybe, well, I'll answer that question from the perspective of, in terms of if there's a reduced amount of, energy at a site, what'll happen is that amount of reduced energy will be measured during each contract, year of the contract. And then the customer will pay that agreed upon cost per unit of energy saved. So going back to that example I had where the customer at the start of the arrangement was paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and hypothetically the service provider charges them 7 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, let's assume that's in year one, and maybe trying to assume what the question is here. If that utility rate, goes up to 9 or 10 cents, the customer still will be paying that agreed upon 7 cents per kilowatt hour saved, or whatever escalation rate was added to that. And of course, the converse is true as well. If the customer starts out with a utility rate of 8 cents per kilowatt hour and it somehow drops down to 5, they'll still pay the agreed upon cost per unit of energy saved that was in the contract with the service provider. So hopefully I touched on part of what that question was about.
Great job. So next question, maybe more of something for Geoff. Do any of the impending accounting changes, such as lease and debt accounting, potentially impact the off-balance sheet nature of these contracts?
Yeah, another great question, and I'll let Bob also jump in, sort of at the end. This is the idea that these are service contracts and service agreements. So not necessarily under an operating lease standpoint, and the accounting changes as it relates to taking the majority of an operating lease on balance sheet. Again, the idea here is that these are service agreements, and that is the basis from which they are drafted, constructed, and implemented. And so, under the service agreement concept, again, that is the idea that you've got third-party ownership. These are not operating leases, but these are in fact, service agreements. Not to say that accounting changes can't, change as it relates to service agreements, and all of that is taken into consideration. And Bob, I don't know if you have anything to add from this. I know you're much more involved, from that aspect, especially from a marketing standpoint.
Yeah, we get engaged in a lot of discussions with customers on this, and obviously we're not, an accounting firm, and ultimately each customer has to make their own determination. But I can speak to that a little bit. So over the last several years, there were kind of a slow roll of accounting changes regarding lease standards. And the current really, from a FASB and the US perspective, it's ASC 842 is the current guidance that's utilized to determine whether a contract is a lease or not. And there's a couple key factors that we talk about with customers as they're going through their evaluation from an accounting perspective. One is what Geoff touched on, that the service provider should be a true third-party equity owner of the project. You should have a project structure with very clear variable payments where the customer agrees to pay a certain cost per unit of energy saved, but then the amount of payment that they make is determined each year by a measurement and verification plan and report that'll document what the savings are. So there's some variation of payments that go up and down. But what also is critical under ASC 842 and was really part of the whole, it's an overarching theme of the changes that were done to lease accounting, is who has control of the project. And control from an accounting perspective really is touched on a lot of different levels. Some of them are the items that I mentioned, but also control is who is receiving really the economic benefits of the project. And here it's important to think about what the economic benefits are of a project. Obviously, customers get the benefit of some upgraded facilities, resiliency, improved health of buildings. Those are definitely benefits. But then it's important to look at what is in the actual contract, which is really what the economic benefits are determined about. And there, under a true services agreement, the payments are all based on a cost per unit of energy saved or a cost per unit of energy generated. So those are the benefits, and the service provider takes on the risks. If the project doesn't perform and the amount of savings is lower than what was expected, the service provider receives lower payments. And that is a critical element on the accounting side, and I think it's getting folks comfortable with, as a service I mentioned is somewhat new. People typically have thought of, okay, what's an energy efficiency project? An energy efficiency project is something that is just a bunch of equipment. And I think what we all know is that energy efficiency projects are about a lot more than that. There's a lot of benefits there. It's about creating a resource. And these contracts, from a contractual perspective, quantify what that resource is. And from that perspective, that's the path through on accounting. And some of it is talking with accountants and getting them to realize that energy efficiency just doesn't mean cooling coming out of a chiller. It's about efficiency gains. So anyway, you got me going on accounting, but we do talk about it.
A great description, Bob.
So we have several questions that come in, and the theme is the same. I'm going to read one of the questions and maybe add a little bit onto it to cover the whole theme. Is clarify how can a third-party sustainability as a service provider own ECMs within a customer facility, such as owning lighting, chillers, pumps, etc., that are permanently fastened to the building? I thought that anything that is owned by a third party had to be movable in the event the customer ceases payments. And people want to know, related to that, is like what happens at the end of the contract, and how does the equipment buyout or the salvage value get determined? Those types of things about the ownership and the end value of what happens to that equipment.
Sure, those are all good questions, but maybe, Geoff, I can take the end of term one, but and maybe I have some thoughts on the other aspects. But do you want to talk a little bit first, Geoff, about just the ownership of equipment and how you kind of view it from the lending side?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from a lender's perspective, right? We take a lien on the equipment. The idea is that the whole basis of these contracts is third-party ownership, so that the customer doesn't own it. Instead, the service provider does. We take assignment or lenders would take assignment in a security interest in those improvements. And again, the idea is that the parties are coming together and mutually agreeing that the equipment that is being installed is third-party owned. So they agree that the equipment, even though it's installed in these facilities, is essentially equipment and not real estate, that they are fixtures, right? So the parties mutually agree to that. And certainly there may be some jurisdictions or some customers where, again, the solar panels or the light, they may be a little bit more comfortable with those types of equipment that is owned or contracted as a third-party ownership under a SCSA versus, let's say, the more building envelope improvements, right? The windows, etc. Those, certain customers may not agree that those could be covered under an SCSA, but as long as the parties mutually agree to that, and they're allowed to do so, from a lender's perspective, those parties have made that agreement. Lenders will double check, the real estate records to make sure that there is no mortgage on the property. And if there is, the lenders will make sure that they get a mortgagee waiver associated to make sure that these improvements are excluded, from that mortgage. And that, again, would require a mortgagee waiver and consent of the mortgage holder. But again, that's all part of the parties coming together and agreeing that these improvements are covered under a services contract. And Bob, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I think you covered it well. I mean, in our contracts, the property is agreed upon by the parties to be the personal property of Metrus. So that is called out up front. And I think there's examples in other types of financings or arrangements too outside of this that there's some good parallels to draw on. I guess getting to the second question that you had there, Tim, was what happens at the end of the term. And the answer is a couple different things could happen. Contractually, what's laid out is that the service provider and the customer could agree to extend the contract for a to be determined time period. And they could also change the rate. The services rate could change at that point too. So maybe you start with a 10-year agreement, both parties make it a 12-year agreement, and then the services rate or charge that the customer was paying goes down. That's one possibility. Second possibility is that the customer can purchase the assets at their fair market value. And that would likely, given the type of assets and the length of term of contracts, not be a huge balloon payment at the end of a contract. But there'd be some type of payment, and look to the parallels of solar PPAs for that type of end of term arrangement. And then lastly, customers could say to the service provider, listen, we don't want to extend the agreement. We don't want to buy the property. Come and salvage what you can. And that is a contractual option. There'd be, some downsides to that to the customer and the service provider, but that's there and that's part of the arrangement.
Okay, so we've had several questions come in that talk about the market segments that this type of product is working in. One asks for Bank of America, where do you see the markets and geography where this is prominent? Another question relates to why is this not successful in the public sector? And then finally, one wants to know if it's available for the federal sector.
Okay, excellent. So let me start with geographies and areas. Yeah, I mean, it does vary. Certainly there may be state statutes that relate to the reasons why or why not an SCSA or services agreement structure would apply. Certainly, when you think about Florida and Florida school districts, they are pursuing and actively looking at service agreement options as a way to obtain all of these improvements, but stay within state statutes and also to avoid additional stress on the ratings that they carry. That's one of the reasons. There could be also political reasons. So there was a large city in the Midwest who previously did an SCSA as a service structure, and it was very political, right? So that city communicated and told its citizens and told the city council that they were pursuing these projects and they wouldn't be encumbering, a single penny of taxpayer geo obligations as a result, and that the projects would be purely paid from savings. So, and that would be the reason, right? That would be the political reason to pursue as a service contract. So, yeah, there's multiple variables that come into play, and certainly, as I described, there are geographic regions where it is more common than others. This sort of segues into the second part of the question to talk about public sector and why it hasn't taken off as much as it has in the commercial sector. And the reason there is that EPCs and EPC statutes are a very efficient method by which public sector issuers procure energy improvements to their facilities, right? It's very low cost, it's proven, and again, there's state statutes that dictate that. Also, public sector entities, for the most part, aren't as balance sheet oriented or concerned as let's say a commercial entity. But again, as I described, there may be other reasons. It may be political, or it may be trying to preserve a rating or a debt rating for their general obligation debt. And really, they can make the case to the rating agencies that an as a service, even though it may be more expensive, really does work in their favor because they only pay for savings that are achieved, right? So there could be other reasons, but again, the public sector, very efficient method for EPCs. There has been an expansion of as a service contracts in the public sector. Certainly a lot of interest. There's been a lot of discussions and a lot of inquiries that have come in from the public sector as a result of these projects. And I think that will continue, and we will see a continued growth in the public sector as it relates to as a service contracts. As it relates to the federal, ESPC, UESC contracts and as a service, I know that there has been some growth, some activity as it relates to these types of contracts for the federal sector. Bob, I don't know if you have much insight into that that you may describe.
Yeah, I mean, on the federal side, not as much. On I would say, just in terms of market segment coverage, obviously C&I, there's been a lot of this, and geographically, all across the country, really no limitations there. And on the public sector side, I think we've seen a big uptick, and part of that is, obviously on the public sector side, there's been a lot of solar PPAs, and this is really an extension, part of the evolution of the whole as a service market, and doing energy efficiency only through a services agreement, doing clean energy and energy efficiency together. We're seeing more demand and interest for that from the public sector. And part of that, obviously, I think is budgetary constraints. Geoff mentioned, and he's a little closer to the markets and some of the pricing on things. There is a difference in terms of the underlying cost of capital for an as-a-service arrangement compared to, say, just a traditional tax-exempt lease. But, you know, I don't think that difference is that significant. You know, it's probably, well, I'll put that back to Geoff to comment on that. But it's also a different, there's different types of services involved here. You know, it's integrating the technical and the financial. There's ongoing services associated with it. It's the pay for performance aspect to it all and the different balance sheet treatment. So I'll kind of stop there, and maybe Geoff, you could close it out with what you're seeing in terms of the market, in terms of, you know, just pure, you know, non-services agreement versus services agreement within the public sector.
Yeah, so in general, right, and there's a lot of variables that come into play with pricing, the credit quality of the end use customer, the ECMs, the term of the financing, the term of the contracts. But in general, let's just say a typical EPC tax-exempt transaction in the public sector, 15 years plus construction, your interest rate might be in the lower twos. Again, just very, very general. If you were to do that, let's say on a tax-exempt, as a service on a tax-exempt, and there have been certain number of transactions that have happened in the public sector on a tax-exempt basis, you would jump up from, you know, let's say the lower twos to, you know, maybe the lower threes, if you were to switch from a pure, you know, EPC model to an as-a-service. And to the extent that this were a taxable transaction in the muni sector, yeah, you would take another step, you know, taking that up from 3.5% to 4%, to show the taxable equivalent of the financing. So there is an increased cost associated if you were to go from a standard EPC in the public sector market, you know, through a tax-exempt lease purchase or similar, to an as-of-service solution. However, there may be other reasons why, other than pure economics, that a customer may be willing to pursue an as-a-service. And as Bob said, there's been a significant increase in market interest with these types of contracts, even in the public sector. And again, those rates, et cetera, those are pure indicatives based on certain assumptions, and there can be a lot of variability, including, again, the credit quality of the underlying ESCO in a as-a-service solution.
Well, Bob and Geoff, we've come to the top of the hour and the time for our webinar to end. We have a lot of questions that were asked, and you gave some really great answers. My suspicions are that we're going to need to invite you back for a part 2 webinar sometime in the future, just to help carry on the conversation, because there's a lot of interest in this area. But I want to take this time to thank each of you for taking the time to come to our webinar and participate. And I want to thank all those who signed on and listened to this section. We had a great time, and thanks for coming, and we'll see you all later. Stay safe out there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.